everyone, or good evening, good morning, depending on where you're joining from. My name is Courtney Doggart, and I am the president of Network 2020. It is a pleasure to welcome you all to the conversation that we're holding today on geopolitics in the Arctic. It is a very important conversation, particularly as we're around Earth Day and everyone's thinking about the impacts of climate change. I have the honor of introducing our three panelists today. We have three excellent voices joining us from all different parts of the world. Before I introduce them though, I just wanted to give you all a sense of Network 2020 to those of you who are joining us for the first time. So we are a New York-based nonprofit organization that bridges the gap between the foreign policy worlds and the private sector. And so we do this in several ways. We have a number of different programs that we run, including some on-the-ground research programs, which we hope to get up and running again as soon as possible. Hopefully next year we'll be going to Tunisia to do some research. In the meantime, we continue our virtual briefing series, which this discussion is a part of, where we bring leading experts in different topics in foreign policy to engage with an international audience to share their views and answer questions. And so you can check out more of our programs on our website. That's network2020.org. And so without further ado, I'd love to introduce our speakers today. So first we have Erin Sikorsky, and she is the Deputy Director of the Center for Climate and Security, which is really a fantastic DC-based think tank that is looking at the intersection of the environment and its implications for national security. And Network 2020 actually had the honor of bringing a group there a few years ago when we took a trip to DC to learn about what's happening in the national security landscape. And so I've always been a fan of their work, and I'm really delighted that we have Erin to join us today. Her previous work includes working at the National Intelligence Council, where she was really tasked with looking ahead, working on some global trends report, and leading the US intelligence community's environmental and climate security analysis. So we'll get some excellent perspectives from Erin. Next up, we have Alexander Sergunin, who is a professor of international relations at St. Petersburg State University, and also at the Moscow State Institute for International Relations in Russia, which is one of their top universities and held in very high regard. His fields of research, he works on Arctic politics and governance, and also Russia's Arctic sustainable development and Russian foreign policy thinking and making. So we're delighted to have him as well. And he joins us from not far from Lake Baikal right now. And then last but not least, we have Duncan Depledge, who is a lecturer in geopolitics and security at Loughborough University in the UK. And like all other panelists, he is very focused on what's happening in the Arctic, in particular with a look through the defense lens. And he's advised the UK government, among others, on developments in the Arctic as well. So we have a really terrific panel today. And so with that, I'd like to, one, say thank you to all our panelists, and then two, start things off. So Erin, I'm going to turn to you first. With the Arctic quite literally becoming a hot topic because of climate change. Before we get into some of the geopolitics of what's happening, I wanted to just take a step back and ask you, why are we having this conversation now? And if you could just illuminate for the audience, what is that intersection between environment and security?
Sure. Thanks so much, Courtney, for having me, and thanks to Network 2020 for hosting the discussion today. You know, it's really opportune time, as you said, with Earth Day tomorrow, but also the President of the United States, the climate summit that they're hosting tomorrow. They just announced the schedule, and there's going to be a panel led by Secretary of Defense Austin that's specifically focused on climate security and the nexus there. And I think this issue is really at the forefront of the discussion, not only in the US, but also in Europe and Asia and many different parts of the world. So I think we're having the conversation on the Arctic in particular because climate security risks there are not a far off future threat. They're here and they're becoming more concerning every day. The 2019 IPCC Special Report on Oceans and Cryosphere and a Changing Climate found that climate change is evident, everywhere in the globe, from the highest mountain peaks to the deepest oceans, and that the Arctic itself is warming at twice the rate of the rest of the globe. And by some estimates could be largely ice-free in the summers by 2035. As of last summer, the Earth overall had warmed an average of 1.1 degrees Celsius from pre-industrial times, yet the Arctic region had experienced an average of 2.3 degrees Celsius in warming from the 1970s alone. So with these temperature changes come other extreme events across the region: rapid permafrost thaw, increased and enduring wildfires, sea ice decline, and shifting ecosystem dynamics. So due to these changes, as you mentioned, the region is much more accessible. And as we're discussing today, it's playing a role in increasing geopolitical security risks. Before I go, I know that Alexander and Duncan are getting into these implications in much more depth, but I wanted to just kind of highlight what some of these risks are. And again, note that the risks are here. It's not just a future threat, it's happening right now. So I think that's important to recognize, because while it's absolutely critical that the world takes steps to cut emissions and curb warming to prevent catastrophic security risks in the second half of the century, we also have to figure out ways to manage and adapt to the changes that are already baked in. Even if everyone got to net zero tomorrow, a lot of the security risks we're discussing today would still exist. And I think that's important context as we think about these issues. We at the Center for Climate and Security completed a report with the Norwegian Institute for International Affairs earlier this year on climate security in the Arctic. And we looked at two different warming scenarios: a curbed scenario and an uncurbed. And while obviously in the uncurbed, the security risks are greater, in the curbed, they're still there. So what are the risks? And very briefly, I think the first thing you have to understand is climate alone doesn't pose the security risk, right? It's climate change layered on to the other security risks, the other relationships among the actors in the region, where you already have heightened competition, lack of trust, worry, say, about the United States' long-term commitment to NATO. All of these things are part of the mix, right? And then you add climate change on top of that. It's not separate. So there are three areas I'll highlight briefly and then turn it over to my colleagues of risk. One is an increase in commercial activity, and then of course the risk of gray zone operations. A warmer Arctic is an increasingly navigable Arctic, and this will lead to more commercial, civilian, and military activity, increases risks of accidents and misunderstanding. And you also have the likelihood of countries using civilian and commercial actors as potential vehicles for strategic positioning, dual use data collection, gray zone operations. So that's one bucket of risk. A second bucket is strained institutions. And I know this is something that Duncan's written on recently for the Wilson Center. But the institutions that have helped depoliticize and produce stability in the Arctic for several decades may not have the sufficient mandates or authorities or be resilient enough to withstand new demands resulting from climate change. And here's another place where other aspects of the relationships intrude, where the relationship with Russia in other parts of the world around Crimea and elsewhere is influencing what's happening in the Arctic. And then the third area is just increased demands on militaries, right? States are going to place higher demands on their military forces in the Arctic as regards to monitoring, assertions of sovereignty, search and rescue, other Coast Guard duties, potentially for the United States in particular. And so there, at the same time that there are reduced constraints on potential force projection in the region, there's also just a lot more going on and a lot for militaries to handle. And there's also the risk that over-reliance on military approaches then, of course, risks escalating conflict. Because I think the good news about the Arctic is it's been a largely peaceful and cooperative approach to managing the region. And so thinking about how with this new strain posed by more operations and relationships elsewhere, how do you continue that going forward? So I'll stop there, but I'm really looking forward to questions and the discussion today.
Hang on. Okay. For some reason, I can't find my unmute button, but we'll work it this way. Hang on one moment.
Please
Oh, you are muted, Courtney. Sorry.
Okay, there we go. Okay, it was my temporary unmute and now I'm back. So I don't know where you lost me, but so Alexander, I was turning to you and just talking about how Russia is one of the biggest players in the region with just the largest population living north of the Arctic Circle. I think you have the highest percentage of coastline in the Arctic, and also starting next month, Russia will be the chair of the Arctic Council for the next 2 years. So would you mind just talking a little bit about Russia's interests in the region and what you see its priorities being as the chair of the Arctic Council?
Okay, Courtney, let me share my screen. Maybe this slide network 2020 should be switched off. Otherwise, I cannot launch my presentation. Maybe Brian can help. Okay. Okay.
It sounds as though perhaps we've lost Alexander temporarily. If that is the case, I'm just going to stop for a moment and we'll come back to Alexander. Duncan, are you still there?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Okay, wonderful. Then as we wait for Alexander to get back to us, I'd like to turn to you momentarily and just talk a little bit about Europe. And when we had spoken earlier, we had talked about, I'd mentioned, quote unquote, the view from Europe. And of course, you straightened me out and said that, there are many views from Europe. And so, I'd love to hear you outline, if you wouldn't mind, the range of stakeholders in Europe. What are the different views on the Arctic when it comes to different groups of European stakeholders, and why does that matter, and who holds the most sway?
I cannot launch my presentation until this slide is there. If you just switch on this slide, Network 2020, and I can share my screen myself.
Okay. Yeah, I think the problem was okay, good. Okay, so we have you back, Alexander. Okay, so Duncan, we'll hold that thought. We'll come back to you. Alexander, we'll revert to the original plan. So we'd love to hear from you. Thank you.
Could I have a next slide? Okay, thanks. When people talking about Russian Arctic policies, they quite often have a lot of stereotypes or myths about this direction of Russian strategies. The most popular myth is that Russia is an expansionist, revisionist power which aims to dominate the region, which is not true, because actually Russia is preoccupied by the domestic problems. So we have a lot of socio-economic, environmental problems with indigenous peoples inside the Russian Arctic zone. So if you look at Russian strategic documents, you can see that major priorities for Russian policies in the Arctic are related to the domestic problems rather than with the foreign policy ones. One more popular myth is that in its policies, Moscow prefers to use military or hard power instruments because of its economic backwardness or weaknesses, which is also not true, because over the last decade, Russia tried to overcome this backwardness and obtain a lot of technologies, domestic technologies, and also from international partners, ranging from, let's say, extraction of oil and gas from the sea-based platforms to production of liquefied natural gas and shipping it to the Western and the Eastern customers. Then also, one more myth is that Russia's military modernization programs aim to restore and further develop its offensive potential in the high north, comparable with the Soviet one, which is again is not true, because Russian modernization programs simply try to make Russian armed forces deployed to the north more compact, better trained, better prepared for coping with the new kind of threats also emanating from the climate change or from other non-traditional challenges. Also, some people believe that the Putin regime intentionally encourages the nationalistic, imperialistic discourse on the Arctic inside Russia to divert public attention from socio-economic hardships and consolidate its positions domestically. Maybe to some extent it's true. I mean, some parts of Russian domestic audiences, they are actually responsive to that kind of nationalistic stance. But believe me that most of common Russian people, and especially expert community, they are not interested in that kind of discourse, and they don't try to use that kind of nationalistic discourse as a resource for domestic or foreign propaganda. And one more stereotype is that Moscow's soft power strategies are designed to complement the hard power means, the so-called hybrid warfare, which has become a buzzword, which is also not true, because actually, as I mentioned, Russia is much more interested in domestic policies, and actually a foreign policy component or security component of Russian Arctic strategy is very small as compared to the domestic agenda. Can I have the next slide, please? So we have several doctrines or strategies. The first one was adopted in 2008, and the last one was adopted last October. And there's quite a significant shift in terms of paradigm from the first doctrine to the last one. If the first document made emphasis on making the Arctic zone of the Russian Federation as a strategic resource base. So exploitation of natural resources was in the focus of Russian policies at that time. But now, if you look at the most recent documents, the concept of sustainability, the sustainable development became the most important one. Could I have the next slide? Just if you look at the most recent document, which is called this Strategy for Socio-Economic Development of the Arctic Zone of the Russian Federation up to 2035, you can see that threat perceptions, they are completely different from which normally ascribed to Russia. And the most threats are emanating from inside Russia rather than from outside. Things like shrinking population in the Arctic zone of the Russian Federation, underdeveloped social, transport, and informational infrastructure in the region, the slow pace of geological exploration of mineral resources, the lack of state support to the private business operating in the Arctic zone, and so on. Could I have the next slide? And only at the bottom of the priority list, we can find not threats, but challenges, which is different. Challenges is not threat to the Russian Arctic security. Things like efforts of some foreign states to revise the Arctic legal system and create national legal regimes colliding with international law norms. There is a hint to a Norwegian unilateral measure to establish a fishery protection zone, or the complete delimitation of the Arctic maritime spaces, or delimitation of continental shelf. But it should be noted that all these problems, they can be solved peacefully through negotiations. And that there is no need to go to war or to military conflict because of that. And all these disputes, they are being solved through the international institutions through the legal norms and principles, especially United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. For example, currently three submissions from Canada, Denmark, and Russia on the extension of the continental shelf are being revised by the UN Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf. And all three countries are peacefully waiting for that kind of decision. And the final solution should be found by these three countries through negotiations, not through conflicts. The next slide, please. Just briefly, you can see from this slide what kind of national interest or national goals the major important documents set up before Russia. The improvement of the quality of life of the Arctic zone of the Russian Federation population, including indigenous peoples, acceleration of the Arctic zone's economic development, and its greater contribution to the economic growth of the country. Environmental protection and conservation of the indigenous people's traditional way of life, development of international cooperation in the region, again, at the bottom of this list, protection of Russian national interests, including its economic interests. So Russia is mostly interested in economic sphere again, not in the security or military sphere. The next slide, please. And just briefly about the forthcoming Russian presidency in the Arctic Council, which will start in 1 month and will last for 2 years. I should mention two major changes in Russia's strategies toward the Arctic Council. Before the Ukrainian crisis, Russia, as some other Arctic Council member states, they wanted to transform the Arctic Council from an intergovernmental discussion forum to a full-fledged international organization with formal charter, institutional structure, and power to conclude binding agreements. But no longer Russia has that kind of goal, because it's clear that under the current tensions between West and Russia, it's impossible to do that. And it's the interest of all Arctic Council member states to be flexible, to keep the current format, because it allows to just take decisions which are quite efficient, which are quite helpful, without making this institution more formal. The next slide, please. Another change is that Moscow doesn't want any longer to bring hard military security issues onto the Arctic Council agenda. Now Moscow believes that under the current situation, this institution should retain its role as an international body, dealing only with the soft security issues, such as socio-economic problems, environmental, conservation of biodiversity, climate change mitigation, maritime safety, search and rescue operations, local community development, connectivity, and the social cohesiveness of the Arctic regions, Arctic research, and so on. So the next slide. Actually, the Russian agenda for the chairmanship was designed by our foreign minister Sergei Lavrov, and has the following priorities, which actually are important for all 8 member states of the Arctic Council: sustainable socio-economic development on the basis of environmentally clean technologies, development of renewable sources of energy, promotion of so-called circular economy, environmental protection, climate change mitigation and adaptation, cohesiveness and connectivity of the region, improving the well-being of the people living in the Arctic, especially the indigenous peoples, Arctic science diplomacy, and also joint education projects, including further support for the University of the Arctic. And the last slide. Russian Foreign Ministry and also Ministry for Development of the Russian Far East and the Arctic, they specified Moscow's priorities for the chairmanship. Things like further development of Arctic shipping, including the development of the Northern Sea route, development of telecommunications in the region, conservation of biodiversity. There is a special agreement is brewing up in the United Nations on this issue, meaning conservation of biodiversity beyond the national jurisdiction in the central part of the Arctic Ocean. Increasing biosecurity, including anti-epidemic measures, the nuclear waste treatment, very important thing for Russia, where a lot of nuclear reactors were dumped in the Soviet time in the Barents Sea and the Kara Sea. Organization of Arctic Indigenous Peoples Summit, Arctic cruise and coastal tourism, establishment and development of international Arctic hydrogen energy applications and demonstration stations, Snowflake in the polar Ural, and creation of an international Arctic development fund, which should be helpful to develop circumpolar projects. That's briefly the Russian agenda for its chairmanship for the next 2 years.
All right, wonderful. Thank you very much, Alexander. I appreciate it. And thank you everyone for bearing with the technical difficulties. So we've covered a little bit, we set the stage, we talked a little bit about Russia's outlook in particular for its own region and also as chair of the Arctic Council. Duncan, turning to you, I had started off this question and then we reverted back. What do things look like from Europe? What are the different stakeholder groups in Europe, and what's being said, and how does jostling or not jostling among different European stakeholders matter when it comes to the Arctic?
Yeah, sure. Well, look, the first thing to say is thank you, of course, for inviting me to speak today, and it's a pleasure to be here. And I think you hinted at the answer in your preamble earlier when you talked about the fact that there are multiple Europes at play here. We're very used to talking about multiple Arctics, but we don't often think about multiple Europes. And in Europe, both geopolitics and geography matter. So we can already start to divide up, if you will, the European stakeholders, for example, by their relative proximity to the Arctic. So you have countries like, you have 5 European Arctic states. Some of those are members of NATO, some of them are not, some of them are members of the EU, some of them are not, and Denmark is a member of both of them. So already you have this kind of complex mix of relationships among these countries. You then, as well as having a distinction to make between the Arctic and the non-Arctic European states, we can also see several European states that like to think of themselves as near Arctic states. This idea of near Arctic is something that's more commonly associated with China, but the UK actually started calling itself the Arctic's closest neighbor well over 10 years ago, long before China did. And it's actually quite interesting that Estonia, which is one of the countries that has recently applied for observer status at the Arctic Council, has made a play to be the northernmost EU state, closest to the, I should say non-Arctic EU state. So these kind of proximities matter in terms of thinking about who's interested and how interested they are. We then also have to think about different issue areas. So, Europe as a whole is interested in the Arctic for military reasons, for scientific reasons, for commercial reasons. And depending on which issue you take, you will find a different group of countries, really leading the way and trying to develop different stances on all these things. Now, having said all that, I think there are some kind of some broad brushstrokes that we can use to think about what the Arctic means to Europe. And the first is that by and large, certainly over the last 10, 15 years, it has been the European Arctic states, the Nordic states, that have perhaps been the most open to further internationalization of the Arctic. So looking to actors from beyond the region to see how they can be brought into the tent, if you will, to engage particularly on science, but also around commercial interests and so on. Countries like Norway are very, very keen that their military allies should not ignore the Arctic. So again, they provide, and here they're not just looking to other allies among the Arctic states, they're also looking to their non-Arctic allies, your UKs, your France, Germany, to show that they understand and are able to operate in the region militarily. So that would be the first thing to take, and this contrasts quite strongly, I think, particularly with Certainly historically, Canada taking a far more exclusive view of the Arctic as being very much for the circumpolar states. And I think Alexander would probably agree that the Russian perspective is very similar to that as well, that first and foremost, this is a region for the Arctic states. Second is to say that whilst the EU and NATO command a lot of attention, here I'm thinking about European NATO, of course, they do so because of the resources they bring to the table. So if NATO speaks about the Arctic, then this matters because of the military resources that the NATO has. When the EU speaks about the Arctic, this matters for scientific and commercial reasons. But and so we spend a lot of time talking about NATO needs a strategy or the EU needs a strategy for the Arctic. But I think perhaps the most significant thing about both of these organizations is that they are distracted and divided when it comes to the Arctic. So there is no common position within NATO, for example, about how present NATO should be in the Arctic, how much it should be engaging, how far north it should be going with its operations, which operations should be badged as this is NATO, all 30 members, and which ones are kind of smaller groupings within NATO leading the way. Similarly for the EU, and here we can think especially about the kind of the distractions that have faced the EU over the years, because I think it was around 2007 that the EU first started trying to develop a kind of a formal strategy or policy for the Arctic. But almost every time it's delivered the high level rhetoric, but then global financial crisis, Brexit, migration challenges, pandemics, all of these things, there's always something else to be thinking about first. And I think that has distracted the EU from a kind of a sustained engagement with the Arctic, along with various other issues that it has had in terms of trying to navigate some of the tensions that it's had over the years with Canada and Russia over specific issues in the region. Then thirdly, I think is really just to identify the fact that the two things that perhaps unite Europe and the Arctic are the concerns about Russia and China. And I think these are not unique to the Arctic in any way. I think it's rather that the Arctic is just seeing another manifestation of concerns that are appearing across Europe in relation to Russia and China. But in the case of the Arctic, and I fully acknowledge all of the things that Alexander was saying about Russia and its interests, and about the tendency to stereotype Russia in certain ways. But I think what is true in Europe is that whatever the reasons for increased Russian military activity in the Arctic, from a European perspective, that is very, very difficult to disassociate from Russian activities in other parts of Europe. And here, Ukraine obviously looms particularly large, but we can also think about the Baltics. And this general sense, I think, in Europe that Russia is to some extent trying to divide or disrupt the kind of the cohesion that Europe relies on, both within the European Union and NATO. And so, I think they're the lenses that are put on when the kind of potential for Russia to pose a strategic threat in the Arctic. Similarly for China, I think there's broad agreement that China's interest in the Arctic is scientific, it's commercial, there may be some long-term strategic aspirations. But rather than seeing China as kind of an immediate threat or a military player in the Arctic, I think the question is, do China's long-term aspirations for the region, are those aspirations actually compatible with the kind of the existing status quo in the region? I think this goes back to Erin's point about the kind of the strained institutions and things. So, it's not saying that China is trying to change things in the Arctic, but as we go forwards over the next decade and things, does the way that China pursue its aspirations and are the things that China wants to see happen in the Arctic going to be in keeping with as I said, status quo? And here this is where we kind of get into this interesting question. I'm sure Alexander will have some sort of thoughts on this, about the kind of this idea of a Russia-China alliance in the Arctic, which I think there's a great deal of skepticism about, certainly among the people that I talk to. But it is interesting, I think, to watch that relationship as a kind of a barometer of how Russia in particular is feeling about the status quo. And for as long as that status quo, Russia feels that it can meet its interests according to that status quo, that I think we're fine. And I think that's where we need to be engaging closely with Russia to make sure that it does feel that way. But I think if we did see a tightening of the relationship between China and Russia, then that would be speaking to a very, very different view of the Arctic in Russia to the one that it holds today. Because I think at the moment it's still very different to how China sees things. So yeah, what that kind of ultimately leads to, I think, though, for Europe as well, is just this strong sense now that perhaps the Arctic can't be seen in isolation anymore, that what happens in the Arctic doesn't just stay in the Arctic. It matters to the Nordic countries, but it also matters to those countries closest to the Arctic Circle, so the Baltics, the UK, Northern Europe, and this kind of almost arc of concern now spreading from the Arctic all the way down to the Black Sea and into the Mediterranean.
Thank you, Duncan. Yeah, so it sounds like the big takeaway there is really just this increased internationalization of the Arctic space. Before I turn to the audience Q&A, and at this point, if anyone has any questions, please do put them in the Q&A box. I wanted to follow up on this question about China, because again, it's hard to have any conversation, I think, on foreign policy these days without delving into China. And so I wanted to turn to the rest of the panelists, starting with you, Erin, just to get your sense on, what China's role in the region is and how you see that, in particular from the view from Washington, what you're looking at.
Sure, thanks, Courtney. And I mean, I think Duncan laid out some of the key points there really well, and noting again that you can't divorce what's happening with China in the Arctic from what's happening with China in the rest of the globe, particularly from, I think, DC's perspective. When I was prepping for this panel, I was going back and reading some articles, and there's a great quote from 2010 from the director of the Dalian Maritime University in China, their research center for polar maritime studies, saying, "Whoever has control of the Arctic route will control the new passage of world economics and international strategies." And again, this is from 2010. So it's clearly, as in many other areas of the globe, China has large ambitions, I think, in the Arctic, both commercial and I think potentially military objectives to think about and be aware of. China's aiming to use Russia's Northern Sea route to ship goods and other materials to and from ports in Europe. They formalized this ambition in January 2018 in their first public Arctic policy, and that's where this declaration of being a near Arctic state and articulating their intention to build a polar Silk Road. And they've talked about potentially not just the Northern Sea route, but potentially later across the central Arctic Ocean in the long term, using a shorter transpolar sea route across the very top of the Arctic, if that opens in a few decades due to melting sea ice. I will say, I mean, this is important and we need to talk about it, but if we get to the point where the sea ice has melted to that extent, there are going to be bigger problems, I think, due to climate change around the globe and security risks due to climate change around the globe. So I think it's important not to lose the forest for the trees too in some of these discussions about competition in the Arctic and whatnot. I do think the main focus needs to be on managing and mitigating the climate change aspects to secure things elsewhere as well. So I'll stop there, but I do think China certainly is looking at this area very carefully as part of its overall strategic plan around the world.
Great, thank you, Erin. And before I turn to Q&A, Alexander, is there anything that you can add for us in the context of Russia, China in the Arctic?
Maybe my opinion is slightly different from Erin's or maybe other people. I think that I'm quite skeptical about the significant role of China in the Arctic. I think it's a huge gap between words and deeds. China is very strong in terms of symbolic policy, declarations, but when it comes to the real actions, it's a completely different story. For example, when Sino-Russian cooperation in the Arctic started at the end of 0 years, there was a lot of hopes that China will bring investment, technology, technologies to the Russian Arctic economy. For example, China promised to renovate the Murmansk port, Arkhangelsk port, will invest money to the development of the so-called Belkamur railway, which connects Komi Republic, White Sea ports, and Murmansk region. But nothing happened at all. So the only project which was implemented was the construction of this Yamal LNG plant in Sabetta on the Yamal Peninsula. And now we have plans to construct the second LNG plant also in Yamal. That's it. So China's role actually is reduced to the customer, to the recipient of Russian LNG. That's it. I mean, in the Arctic, and Russia is not interested in China's geopolitical role in the Arctic. Russia is interested only, again, in a very pragmatic sense, Chinese investment and technologies. That's it, nothing more. And I'm quite skeptical about the potential duo of Russia and China, the geopolitical duo in the Arctic. Russia doesn't want any military presence in the Arctic, any other states. So Russia is self-reliant, is able to protect its national interests without China or any other country. So I think that there are ups and downs in the Chinese interest in the Arctic and politics, but currently, I guess there is a shift from high expectations to reality. So China is, for China, the Arctic is one of many regions which can be potential interest, including the maritime routes, but not the main one, or even not the third one. It's just something that at the bottom of the priorities.
Thank you very much, Alexander, for that. So now I'm turning to the Q&A box, and one of the first questions I want to ask is actually along the lines of something that I had hoped to ask in our more formal moderated conversation, but we didn't have the time. And this is from Tarag Abu Salah, who asks, how can the Arctic countries build trust and enhance cooperation in all domains? And so Duncan, I think I'd like to turn to you for that, because I know we had talked a little bit about some of the cooperation in the Arctic. And so could you elaborate on that, on how the Arctic countries can build trust and enhance cooperation?
Sure, Courtney. Do you mean in scientific terms or military terms?
Well, the question is across the board, but I think from your perspective, where is cooperation currently happening, and where is are there other areas that cooperation is ripe for?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think the key area is obviously still scientific exchange. I think for decades, science has probably been the one thing that has held doors open and kept dialogue going in the Arctic when everything else has fallen apart. And I think that remains the case now. And we can see through all kinds of initiatives that even when tensions elsewhere are high, the science is still being developed. I mean, even since the Ukraine crisis began in 2014, it didn't really have a significant effect on the Arctic Council in terms of what it was doing, its working groups. We still continue to see progress to negotiate this agreement on scientific cooperation, which Alexander mentioned on the slides. We've seen continued cooperation developing since 2015 on Arctic coast guards, and if you follow any of the news in this space, you would have seen that there was just a rather successful, well, it's been billed as a successful virtual coast guard exercise involving all 8 Arctic states. So soft security, I think, is the other area where there is still quite strong potential to keep doors open and keep dialogue going, and hopefully as a consequence of continuing to meet and discuss these areas of common interest and shared interests, in the margins of those, it may be possible to make progress on other points of contention.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you very much, Duncan. We have a question, and I'm going to turn to you with this for this, Alexander. And it's about one of the audience members wants to know about your explanation for Russia's Arctic military buildup and increased military Arctic exercises and movement.
I think the format of this question is slightly incorrect, in the sense that when we are talking about military buildup, it means that the country which does it increases a number of servicemen in the area, a number of weapon systems, intensifies its military activities, and so on. But everything is relative. You should remember about the situation which we had in the 90s and the early 2000s in the Russian Arctic. The situation was very close to the real collapse. I mean, the armed forces deployed to the Arctic. The Russian armed forces deployed to the Arctic were just degraded. There was almost nothing over there. The air defense system was destroyed. The soldiers, the servicemen, they had a very low moral spirit. I traveled that time on the Kola Peninsula. I have seen how the soldiers and officers behaved. And I wouldn't say that it's a real army. So there was decay in the Russian armed forces over there. So much more correct to say about military modernization programs. And the mission or the aim of that kind of military modernization is just to make these armed forces, as I mentioned, more compact, better trained, better equipped, better trained for meeting non-traditional threats. In terms of numbers, there is no comparison with the Soviet time, with the Cold War period. In the Soviet time, we had 3 divisions: one motor rifle division, one tank division, and one marine infantry division. Now we have 3 brigades: one motor rifle brigade, one marine infantry brigade, and one Arctic brigade, which is armed with the light weapon systems. So in terms of military potential, what we have now is much less than it was in the Soviet time. So there is no military buildup. If you look at the strategic component of the Russian armed forces deployed to the Kola Peninsula, the number of submarines, nuclear submarines, strategic submarines, is much less than it was in the Soviet time. If you look at the number of surface large vessels, much less than in the Soviet time. So I mean, the Russian Navy, the conventional Navy, which is not designed for the global confrontation with the United States, but the Navy which is designed for the local military theater, is comparable in terms of numbers with Norway, with Denmark, with Canada. So and you combine, for example, conventional forces on the NATO side and compare it with the Russian side, Russia is inferior. So, but Russia doesn't want to challenge NATO in a military sense. Russia simply wants to have armed forces which are adequate to the contemporary challenges. That's it. So no build up, no arms race, no violation of military balance in the Arctic.
Thank you. Thank you for that clarification. I do want to do a quick follow-up because I see a question in the Q&A box that's related to that. And I really appreciate your clarification. The question is about, so you just clarified that there's modernization going on, but not build-up. The question is sort of flipping this now and saying, okay, well, if Russia doesn't feel the need to establish a big military presence in the Arctic because for whatever reason, will this attitude change if or when other countries build up military bases in the region? So what happens if it's not Russia doing it, but then other countries do it, and then how do you foresee Russia responding?
Well, other Arctic states, they do the same like Russia. They renovate military bases, air bases, naval bases. They deploy new, more sophisticated weapon systems. They create special Arctic units, like, for example, Norway also established the Arctic Brigade following Russia. So, I mean, it's a common trend. I mean, the common trend is to have less troops, less weapon systems in terms of numbers, but better quality, better trained, better equipped, better designed, especially for these cold weather conditions. I think that's no difference between Russia or Canada or the United States or Denmark or Norway or Finland or Sweden. It's a common trend. And actually, when you ask professional military from all sides, from NATO side, from non-aligned states like Sweden and Finland or Russia, at the professional level, they understand each other very well. And none of them, they don't see any real threat from each other. They believe that Arctic is rather, I mean, it's a benign environment, and military modernization programs, they don't violate military in the region.
Okay, thank you.
Tons of literature is written by professional military try to argue that modernization doesn't mean military build-up.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you for that. Switching gears a little, we have a question from Justin Mitchell, who asks, he writes, it's been mentioned by both military and civilian actors about how important the Arctic is for quote unquote resources, and that these resources need to be protected. Resources primarily meaning fossil fuels, he's saying in this case. Would any of you argue that defending fossil fuels in the Arctic, be it diplomatic or militarily, hinders global efforts to mitigate climate change, install transitions to renewable energies, and distracts from developing better relations? So Erin, I will kick that over to you.
No, I would not argue that defending fossil fuels is the best way to approach the climate crisis that we're currently in, and obviously moving toward renewable energy is the best way to go. I am not an expert on Arctic resources, but my understanding is there are other potential resources that folks are concerned about in the region, including critical minerals, as well as fish resources potentially as the ice melts. That is something that is of serious concern, particularly as fish populations move due to the warming of the oceans in other parts of the world. So it's not just fossil fuels. There are other issues as well that are up for discussion. And I believe there have been some pretty positive engagements, especially around the fisheries. And protecting and kind of pre-agreeing that once the ice melts to not go after the fish there. But Duncan or Alexander might know more about that than I do.
Either of you have any thoughts on that, Duncan?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. I mean, Erin's right. So there is this Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement, which put a moratorium in place for, I think it was 16 years, basically saying that until some sort of decent scientific assessment has actually been made of what these fisheries look like and whether they could be exploited in a kind of sustainable fashion, that they would hold back from that. And I think the interesting thing about that agreement was that it was signed by the 5 Arctic coastal states along with other major fishing nations. So you had so China was one of the countries that signed it, for example, as well as the European Union actually. So it captured the I guess the section of the globe that is most capable and most likely to go after fish in the region. Yeah, and just to echo Erin's points, I mean, one of the interesting things about resources, if we're just talking about hydrocarbons in the Arctic as well, is that now I think we're pretty much just talking about hydrocarbons in the European/Russian Arctic. You know, the North American Arctic has been ruled out again, thankfully. But who knows what happens in 4 years' time, sort of thing. But at least for now. Whereas you know, the Norwegians, I think, are clinging on and still trying to keep going as long as they can with their oil and gas developments. But I just wonder how long that can actually be sustained for. So really, in many respects, it is all eyes on Russia. And you know, how much of the resources that are in the Russian Arctic zone, and we know that there's plenty there, How much oil and gas is Russia going to try and extract while the clock runs down on trying to take this drive to a low carbon or net zero economy globally? There's a bit of a race going on there, I think.
Thank you. So for our final question, I'm going to pick up on a few pieces that I've heard mentioned a little bit. I've heard sustainability mentioned a few times throughout this discussion, and given that tomorrow is Earth Day, and also given that one of the common themes that often has resonated in this COVID era is the idea of building back better. So in the case of the Arctic, and I'm going to pose this to each of you for just a quick, for some quick thoughts. What does it take not to build back better, but to build better, to build sustainably in the Arctic? What does that mean? And what are you looking for, either through international cooperation or through your own countries or regions' efforts in the region? So Alexander, I'll start with you because you mentioned sustainability quite a bit. What does that look like in the Russian context? What do you want to see?
I think it's both. Russia has a quite impressive agenda domestic agenda for providing sustainability. It ranges from a special planning, establishing special planning, strategy planning procedures and mechanisms. We have a series of laws how to plan sustainability at the federal level, at the regional level, and the municipal level. Then also the concept of sustainability means harmonization of three elements: economy, environment, and the social component or the human component. And if you look at documents, the human component or social component at the first place, and major emphasis is made on how to make the life of people living in the Arctic zone, both indigenous peoples and non-indigenous peoples, better and comfortable. A lot of work is done on urban planning and urban development, also environmental, cleanup of the environmental mess, prevention of air and water pollution, that kind of stuff. And also we have a very good cooperation in the Arctic Council. Arctic Council is famous for its very good knowledge and expertise in the sphere of sustainability. There is a special working group within the Arctic Council where Russia, for example, is quite active, and that's a very good experience. Also, the Barents Euro-Arctic Council, another intergovernmental forum. Also, it's a sub-regional organization. It has a narrow focus, but also very good cooperation for sustainability.
Thank you, Alexander. Duncan, really quickly, sustainability. What steps are Europe taking? What are you?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd echo Alexander's point, especially about indigenous peoples. I think engaging with indigenous peoples and local communities in questions about what kind of Arctic they actually want to build and what they want to live in, and how they can, find the good life, so to speak. And I think that also means going beyond looking at the Arctic as a place simply to be exploited for its resources, which is obviously how many south of the Arctic Circle have looked at the region for decades, essentially. And the last point that I would just draw into that, of course, is that it is the almost the decades of underinvestment in Arctic people and infrastructure and communities that has actually created this kind of sense of a void that other actors from beyond the region might now be trying to fill with offers of investment of their own.
Thank you. And then Erin, last word.
Sure, very briefly. I mean, Duncan and Alexander said it so well. Two things I would highlight. One is the importance of keeping the long-term goals in mind in the role that the Arctic plays, not only in the region, but in the globe, right? And again, as I went back to my earlier comments, let's think about what it means for the ice to melt there, and then what that means for the rest of the world. I think bringing in indigenous populations is really important. And then finally, finding ways to communicate amongst all players in a constructive manner, finding the right venues to do that, and to have security discussions when needed as well amongst all players, I think is really important, because you're not going to meet the sustainability goals if you've got the kind of security military competition drowning out everything else. And so finding ways to negotiate that is critical.
All right, on that note, thank you all. Spasiba, Alexander. Thank you, Erin. Thank you, Duncan. It was a real pleasure to talk to you today. Thank you for taking the time and the work that you're doing. And thank you to the audience for wonderful questions. With that, we will let it's well into the 22nd, I think, in Alexander's world. So we'll let you get some rest. And for everyone else, our next briefing is next week on Monday, I believe. We do have a member only briefing tomorrow night, but our next briefing is on Monday at 11. And it is on vaccine diplomacy. So we'll be talking about the soft power aspects of vaccine development, distribution, and funding of COVAX. So please do RSVP. And again, thank you to all of you for coming today. I really appreciate it. Have a great day.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye. My pleasure. Bye-bye.